history. I'm going to leave the modern period mostly to Robert to cover. And I hope to just also set the table a bit and think about suggest how we might think about these buildings and think about their significance to the city. So, first of all, what are we talking about today? Schools as heritage, public schools that have been institutions that have been an integral part of Toronto since the beginning. So this is a picture from 1913 of St. John's Ward. Nothing in this scene exists anymore. This is the Elizabeth Street playground and what was the Hester Howe School, which was famous as a place where the varied immigrants and varied people of the ward, found their way into Canadian society to be educated and strapped along the way. That building's gone. There are very few others of the same period that still exist. This is Central Tech in the 1920s. The public schools have always been a place of learning for everyone and of all sorts of learning. And the schools as educational and social institutions, were closely linked to the growth of Toronto through the second half of the 20th century into the city that we know today. This is Don Millicent, 1959. It's a photo by Hugh Robertson of Panda Associates, which is a name you should know, by the way. It does some incredible work. So what is heritage? These are the three broad criteria that are set out in the provincial legislation for what makes a heritage site. And I won't read it all to you, but the first one is design value or physical value, based on things like architecture. Second is historical or associative value. And the third is contextual value, in defining, maintaining, or supporting the character of an area vitally linked to its surroundings or as a landmark. So if you start with this, I think you really need to assume that every single public school in Toronto qualifies as heritage. At least on the third of these criteria, it would be really hard to see how most of them don't, hit that bar. I'm not suggesting that they should all necessarily be designated or that they should all necessarily be saved, but I would say that, we should be thinking about these sites as heritage much more intensively than we do, and we should almost have a negative presumption about their importance. I think in a nutshell, these public schools are the most important stock of heritage buildings and places in Toronto, bar none. So having said that, we'll get into my field of expertise, which is, or my field of interest, I should say, which is the architecture. So beyond writing for the Globe, architecture criticism is what I do. I worked on a new edition of this book, which came out last year, with photos by Vic Pawa. And in the process of doing that, I really came to understand the point that I was just making, which is that schools have been critical to this place culturally and architecturally. These have been some of the most important places of the city. So here are the periods I'm going to run through quickly. The Victorian and Edwardian schools, the collegiate Gothic style of the 20s, the transitions to modernism, and then quickly, because I'll leave most of this to Robert, the modern period. So the first, let's look at roughly 1880 to 1920. So one question when you're talking about the Toronto schools, I will be focusing here today on, not exclusively, but mostly on schools that were designed by the staff architects of the Toronto Board of Education and its predecessor boards. So who actually did this design work? It's always a bit of a tricky question to figure out who did what when it comes to architecture. But the name, the guy in charge for this important period was Charles H. Bishop, for about a 30-year period, and working under him were a series of other architects who may have really been the main designers of a lot of the significant buildings that remain. Hiram Barber, Franklin Belfry, and Adolphus D. Waste. Isn't that the best name? I love that. Sorry, I know it's juvenile of me, but... So it's This is one example. This is a picture from the 1950s of the Huron Street Public School. The building in the foreground, which is going to be, has some Romanesque detail, is gone. It was built in 1914 and was torn down in the 60s for the modern building that is there now, which is also a good building. But the thing on the background on the right is the 1890 building designed by the Board of Education's architects. It was the Public School Board, and that building is still there. I think Vic has actually photographed it, but I didn't get around to asking him. So that's still hiding. It's one of the few buildings of that period that still stands today. Here's Kent School, which was designed in 1907, finished by 1908, and was in use as a public school for a little over a century. This is at Bloor and Dufferin, and this is part of that site that's now being sold off. This piece of this building, this wing of this building, looks likely to be retained. This is Regal Road Public School, which is really an incredible building on a great site at the top of the hill just off of Dufferin, near Davenport. And then, I should point out that I mentioned the phrase Beaux-Arts, or I had the phrase Beaux-Arts in one of my slides. These big buildings of the 1900s and 1910s were, could all loosely be categorized as Beaux-Arts. So classically influenced, highly symmetrical, and each of them has at least one sort of grand facade with some nice stonework, often a portico like this one. There's some outliers though too. This is Orde Street Public School, which was finished in 1915. This is right near college and university, and you might not have found this unless you were looking for it. It's now sort of buried among hospital buildings and right behind the Toronto Board's old headquarters. And this is a very unusual building for Toronto of 1915. This is a prairie-style building. And this is more or less in original condition. So, the Toronto Board of Education's architects were trying some things, and were consistently building at buildings of high quality that are well detailed, that are well built, made with quality materials, and in some cases pushing things a little bit stylistically. This is where they worked out of the board's administration building, which was located on College Street near McCall and designed by the board staff architects. It opened in 1916, and you'll notice it's kind of dirty, and this picture is taken from a funny angle because it's been buried. In 1960, when the building in front of it, the board's new headquarters, was built, they moved this building back to the middle of the block to make room for the new one, and then left it there. And they're connected by a bridge, which is where I was standing when I took this picture. It's kind of an incredible thing that that building, none of these are in the board's hands anymore. They sold this complex off to the U of T, which has now retained it. But both of these buildings, the 1916 building and then the 60s building, which is designed by Peter Dickinson, are excellent buildings. And the way in which they sit together is, speaks to a certain interest in quality design and a certain architectural freedom that is kind of hard to imagine today. So this is an important point to make, I think, that the school board was a good client. The various school boards were good clients for architects. And as I've looked back over Toronto's architectural history, it seems to me that this is one of the things that's been missing. Not necessarily design talent, but institutions and people who are willing to actually invest in good buildings and be adventurous and be ambitious. And the school boards did that. And in fact, in Toronto, for most of the first 100 years that Toronto was growing, or first 150 years that Toronto was growing after settlement, there were not a lot of institutions that were making great places. And the Board of Education, the various school boards, were doing that. So that's the Bishop period. The Bishop period ends badly in 1919 when Charles Bishop resigns in disgrace after an inquiry into the procurement practices of the board finds that he was being a little bit cozy with certain architects and builders in giving out the work. It's good work, but here we are on to another period. So another figure, the head of buildings for the school board, Cyril Dyson, who was best known for, whose biggest stamp would be the buildings that are in the collegiate Gothic style. So through the 20s, when the city was growing rapidly, both public schools and elementary schools and secondary schools, particularly the vocational schools, there were a lot of them going up. They are really big, really well-built buildings, and remain landmarks in the city today. And he really drove that agenda. This is the start of an article that he wrote for the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada's Journal in 1927, I believe, 1927 or 28. So this is a two-part article by Dyson surveying the state of school design in Canada, focusing on Ontario, and then giving examples from the work that's been done by and for the Board of Toronto. So this is East York High School, designed by George Roper Grinlock. From the same issue, this is Jarvis. These are photographs of Jarvis from 1927. So, I mean, you can get this from looking at these buildings today, but perhaps even more so by thinking about these buildings in context. These were not cheap buildings. These were not expedient buildings. Now, these were buildings of public purpose that were really intended to communicate and to capture the value that the community placed on public education. And they're really good. And those that survive, people love them today. This is Central Tech at Bathurst and Harvard. The main building went up in 1915, is that correct? I think that might actually be not correct, but was the biggest high school in Canada when it was completed. And here, again, is Dyson writing in the RAIC Journal in the same year, just setting out a sample of the mid-sized elementary school that was going up in crowded districts in the 20s. And this is General Mercer Public School, that's it, which stands today. This is just off Rogers Road in York. So, I mean, you can see they were building 3-story plus basement buildings, in York 100 years ago, which is taller and denser than a lot of the elementary schools that the province is building today. And this thing is, a dowager, but remains in quite good shape. Here's a drawing published in the Toronto Star in 1930 of the new front of Harvard Collegiate, which I don't have a picture of, but it was built more or less like this. And here is Northern, what was Northern Vocational School when opened in 1930. And here you can really see the scale of this thing, in the city at that time, which was a much smaller place than it is today, a much poorer place than it is today. These buildings were not only authoritative, and not only did they communicate the importance of education, but they were also huge. So we'll get through this quickly the next 20 years or so. This is Dovercourt Public School near Dovercourt and Bloor. And then Bloor Collegiate was just discussing this with the writer Tim Morowitz. This was done in 1948-49, and you could loosely term it an Art Deco building. These wings are another thing that are up for discussion as part of the Bloor-Dufferin redevelopment I was talking about earlier, along with Kent School. And then around the corner, not around the corner, this is Fern Avenue, built around the same time. And you can't see it too well in this image, which is a Google Street View image, but there's some really nice deco detailing that went into this. Likewise, Brock Avenue Public School near Bloor and Dufferin, where if you look above the arch, there's the nice deco lettering carved into the stone. And then that wing to the left, I don't know when that was designed, but I suspect it was around the same time. So somebody in the Board of Education offices was, they were generally pretty conservative in style, but they were definitely starting to push forward into some different stylistic territory. And right at the same time is this piece. So we saw the front of Central Tech earlier. This is the southern wing of Central Tech, which was designed in the late 40s and finished in 51, I think. So the back of it is modern of this wing, and then you see this front of it, which has got these kind of Gothic pieces stuck onto what is an asymmetrical, clearly modern facade. This is a very weird building. Someone I know was joking that this is the first postmodern building in Toronto. And then quickly, because again, Robert Mofford is going to cover this territory, things changed rapidly in the post-war period. This is the Parkin office in Etobicoke with the Sunnylea School, which was very forward-looking for its time, patterned after the Crow Island School designed by Perkins and Will, which was the latest thing in education. Then the Toronto board wound up hiring a lot of the better architects in town. There was a lot of work to go around in schools. So a lot of the best architects in the post-war period in Toronto did schools. This is by Peter Dickinson's office from the early 60s. This one is in York for the York Board, Keelsdale Public School, which has been in danger of closing. I have no idea who designed this thing, but it's really good. Moving forward in North York, this is Moriam. Am I right, Vic? Yeah. It's A.Y. Jackson, which is an incredible brutalist building designed by the Moriam office. And then this is designed by John Andrews. This is Belmere Public School in Bendale and Scarborough, which is an amazing building. Each of these chunks, this sort of tent-like shapes, holds a classroom, and there's skylights at the top. One more look at the Central Tech campus. This is the Arts Center of Central Tech, 1962, Macy Du Bois. One of the very first buildings in Toronto that could be characterized as brutalist. It's a magnificent building. Designated heritage and in terrible shape right now. It's clearly going to need some maintenance, and I look forward to seeing how the school board is going to remedy that concrete. And then very quickly, the board's own architects, Frederick Etherington was the head architect, but the design architect through the 50s into the 60s was Peter Pennington, who designed this building where we stand today, along with a body of other work that, if you look for it, is quite distinctive and really quite beautiful, including the doomed Davisville Junior Public School. This one in the beach, and the building where we stand today. So what can we learn out of all of this? The school boards in Toronto have built well. They have been the school board's own architects were at various points national leaders in terms of design quality and excellence. This is another Peter Pennington building, Lord Lansdowne Public School, one of my favorites near College in Spadina. This is on the cover of the National Journal, RAIC Journal, in 1961. And they tried stuff. This is an article by Pennington that interviews Pennington in the Star in the early 60s, where he starts talking about the schools of the future, which are going to be underground. Because city land is so expensive, why not put it to better use? Underground schools are inevitable as at the 15-cent cup of coffee, says Peter Pennington. I'm not suggesting that was a good idea, but, and I'm also not suggesting we're going to repeat that, but there's evidence that it is possible to do schools that are of their time architecturally and of good quality and also innovate, like this one in Don Mills by Cohn Schneer, completed a few years ago. And then there's a question of what to do with heritage. This very, unfortunately, controversial project in Regent Park, which retained this building from 1907 and added onto it, is, I would argue, not a masterpiece, but is a very good building and is a good example of how the school board itself can, if it is allowed to, retain heritage buildings that have some quality and some value to the community and make new schools out of them. Quickly, I'm just going to leave you with a couple of images of this in Denmark. This is in Aarhus in Denmark, a school called the Sodervine School. It's a very ordinary 60s building that has been updated with an eye on keeping kids active. So, you can sort of get a sense of how, familiar and ordinary this building is with its terrazzo and brick and acoustic tile ceilings, but, keeping that in place, they managed to do something interesting with it. Finally, I want to close by talking about heritage as public assets, which they are. This Bloor Dufferin site, the stuff in red, Kent School in the foreground, Bloor Collegiate in the background, is all being sold off right now. And as I've said pretty clearly earlier, I don't think that's a wise idea. I think looking at this history that we've just been going through and considering where the city is going as well, we should really think about how to retain these buildings for public use and figure out how they can be used differently wherever possible. Such as this one on Shaw Street, 1908 building, magnificently rebuilt or renovated for use by artists and cultural creators by Artscape, now one of my favorite places in the city. So I'm hoping that, building on this legacy of quality and also having perhaps a more respectful attitude to heritage than some of our predecessors, we can figure out how to keep these places as places of prominence in the city, and give them the respect they deserve. Thanks.